Oh, hello, and welcome or welcome back to Read Becca. It's time for a return to normalcy and routine, I think. I've been off on an extended break that has upended all of my usual routines, including my weekly check-ins, but we are back to weekly check-ins on everything that I read, everything I'm currently reading, and everything I'm looking forward to reading, what I watched, some general life stuff, and recommendations from roughly the current week. So let's dive in with my reading this week. Because it was HalloWEEK, a bit unintentionally, though that was the vibe I was going for, I wound up reading only horror this week, really. So I finished 3 things, and in fact, we're going to go both in terms of timeline and in terms of enjoyment. So it was an upward trend toward Halloween, in fact. And first, we'll start with The Kraken by E. Catherine Tobler. This was okay, and it's very short, so that was probably the only reason I fully finished it. This is a book I've had on my shelves for quite a while. I won this, in fact, from World Builders, a fantasy fans charity event where if you donate money that goes to Harper International, you get thrown in a lottery and lots of people win books, basically. So I did that, I won some books, and I'm glad to finally have read this, and I think it will probably not be staying on my shelves. This was purely a tonal issue, I think, really, for me. Multiple things in this didn't work for me as a reader of horror, though it seems like it should have been exactly my sort of thing. There's not a lot of graphic violence or blood or gore throughout this. It's very sort of atmosphere, and right from the beginning, we're following a boy. He's 15, so he's kind of in that space in between childhood and adulthood, and doesn't really fit in either place, but he's been cared for as a foundling by nuns, and Sister Jerome Grace in particular has taken an interest in him and is taking him somewhere. And so a lot of this was very intangible and sort of hard to get a handle on. And I think that's an intentional tactic from horror authors to keep the reader on their feet, on their toes, not aware of what's going on, not feeling it's tangible, and easy to throw off balance. So I don't get along with that. I wanted a lot more tangibility to the sense of place, to the sense of character than I got. So I think she took him to Chicago and stayed and stopped there, but I'm not sure. Because this is the Kraken Sea, there isn't ever any real ocean, as far as I noticed. Much more, this is about like sideshows and carnival folks and things like that, without actually completely going all the way to like traveling carnivals. So we go somewhere to a place that has these sort of sideshow freaks, more or less. And for reasons, the main character is not a normal person, as is Sister Jerome Grace. And that's kind of why she's taken this interest. And so he finally feels like he's found a place, but there's this great division and kind of turf wars going on between different groups in this town. And he doesn't really follow what he's told. So that seems to be much more what this book is about. I liked a lot about the atmosphere and the vibes. There wasn't a lot of graphic violence. There wasn't a lot of gore or body horror to this. There was tonally something else that really didn't work for me in that. There's no graphic sex in this either, but it is very sexually charged, and throughout, the gaze is very sexual, I think, and that just turned me off through the whole book. So there was a lot of those things that were not even major elements. They're almost background, but lots of how this was delivered was not the book for me. So I think I'm glad I read it to finally have read it and get it off my shelf and pass it on to someone who will enjoy it much more than me. I finished that one without really even knowing what the point of the book was, honestly. So next, on to one that was more successful. This is The House of Drought by Dennis Mombauer. And as you can see here, we've got a World Fantasy Award finalist badge on there. And this is from Stelliform Press, who are specifically a kind of environmental and climate speculative fiction publisher. I got this when I ordered A Boreality from them because they published the winner of the Le Guin Prize last year. So on paper, this was a great book. I did really enjoy it, but I did kind of fail to get an emotional connection with the characters or the story that would have really pushed it to be a book that I loved. This is again a very short one, but I liked so much about it, and it is very different from anything I have read. So throughout this book, we're almost getting vignettes, but not quite. We start with the framing device of a film crew who are going to make a documentary, and they're talking about the state of Sri Lankan climate. So we're in Sri Lanka for the whole story, and they're talking through essentially the fact that climate has so affected food production and farming there, and then get wind of this strange house in the forest nearby. And of course, that is the House of Drought. So along the way, we are getting these vignettes through time of this house and the people who have gone and lived there and their experiences there. And over this time, we're getting so much more background about the ways that Sri Lankan native farmers knew how to deal with cycles of rain and drought, and colonialism coming in and really destroying their local practices, those sorts of things. We're also tying in some major folklore elements. There's this big myth of the sap mother. And so all of that over these multiple stories is getting unveiled to us. And I think very obviously, just from that premise, you can tell that the documentary crew are uncovering these stories themselves and are starting to incorporate that into what they're wanting to do, right? And so there is a confluence between those things. And so I just enjoyed that so much. Again, virtually no graphic violence or real body horror to this one. Very atmospheric and kind of gothic, without your traditional kind of manor house gothic. There is a house, but it's very different from what you would expect. And it has that strong folklore tie rather than sort of the very proper Victorian like ghost story. So I enjoyed so much of what this was doing. And again, as I said, like, it felt like this should have been a favorite that I really attached to, but I just didn't connect as much with the characters. And I think that's because we were flitting through so many things very rapidly. We didn't get any individual protagonist really throughout this book. So yeah, this was very good. And I'm super happy, and I need to continue on with more of the books I ordered from Stellaform last year, because I still have more yet to read. And then finally, the one I finished out the week with was a massive success. I really love this book. And that was Craven Manor by Darcy. As you can tell, this is a gothic manor house story, though it is contemporary rather than historical. And we're following this one main character, Daniel. And I think I kind of have to get into the nitty-gritty of my reading experience with this one for you to know why I loved it so much. So Daniel, in chapter 1, I connected so hard and so viscerally with him emotionally. So completely the flip from what the previous book was for me, where I just was in it emotionally immediately. We're getting a lot of commentary on capitalism in this. He is someone who was homeless before and is now jobless. And so he feels he's a burden on those around him. He's one misstep away from going back into homelessness. And so he's kind of living in fear of that. He doesn't have a lot of options. And that is something that keeps coming up over the course of this, that desperate people can't, have options. And he's so empathetic. Every moment of this story, he is empathizing with everyone around him and caring about people. In the initial opening, there's a little old lady who he's aware that she is struggling and failing financially and not getting by. And even though he's at the bottom himself, he's making the effort to care for her. And I just got so emotional. Like, I don't know why, but it was just too much for me right at the beginning. He also totally empathetic to animals, and we do have multiple animals throughout this book that are never at any point under any threat, thankfully. So I just was right connected with him immediately. So he's in this terrible situation in chapter 1, and he gets a strange letter inviting him to take a job as a groundskeeper at Craven Manor, a place he has never heard of before, and a place he did not apply for a job to. But because he is in this position of desperation and has no other options, he sort of feels he has to take it, or at least give it a shot. So he shows up in chapter 2. Chapter 2 is him finding his way there, and he's so self-aware throughout. That's another thing that really endeared him to me, is that he is so self-aware that, yeah, this is the horror house. Somebody's gonna steal my kidneys. But he also is very self-aware when weird stuff starts happening too. And I found that very relatable because like, so it's a horror novel. You know this is gonna happen, but he sees something that is definitely unreal, right? And I'm not going to tell you what it is or spoil any of that, but he sees something that's definitely unreal, and his reaction is the initial shock and horror, and then he starts rationalizing it. He thinks about the rules he's been given, and oh, okay, this doesn't make sense. And then goes, well, I guess, okay, I'm staying. And it was like, yeah, that's totally what I would do. I would be like, I guess this makes sense. Okay, I can work with this. You know? So he was so very, very relatable as a character, and I just found him so richly developed as a human being I could connect with. And that's why this was such a strong, strong book for me. So he shows up at this manor house, and I don't want to tell you too much about the plot, but clearly this is a very old manor house. No one is around, in fact, when he shows up. And so that's part of the mystery. He keeps getting these directions to do things, and as the groundskeeper to upkeep things. And he doesn't really know where they're coming from, necessarily. And he keeps uncovering the history of this manor house, and that is really the story. So there's very much about this story to do with capitalism and power over one another, the care we have for each other, and the fact that no one is entirely good or bad is a really prominent theme. There's also a pretty big element to this of how history is controlled by the teller. And that may be different depending on who's telling the story. I had specifically picked this up because Darcy Coates is often referenced as someone to kind of go to if you are a fan of T. Kingfisher. And based on this, 100%. If you like T. Kingfisher's sense of sort of empathy and supportive, connective tissue between the people, the characters in her books, this has that. This does not have the over-the-top quirky characterization and character voice that T. Kingfisher is sort of known for, and I know a lot of people bounce off of that. So this may be one to go to if you thought you might like T. Kingfisher but didn't get along with the quirky characters. I really, really enjoyed this. This also, 3 for 3, was not very violent or graphic. There were some things that were described that were kind of gross, but very minimally, honestly. There is great atmosphere to this, like super perfect gothic atmosphere, super creepy scenes, but very little violence. I think this was just a great, great example of really fully realized creepy story with fleshed out characters and setting that didn't lean into or engage with those sort of shock factor elements or gruesome violence for the reader to try and manipulate us into being horrified, you know? Even throughout, the tension was very low. Like, most of this, the empathy was so high and the tension was so low that it was kind of a feel-good book for a horror book, which is weird to say. But I enjoyed that so much. I thought it was great. So I would definitely read more from Darcy Coates, though I know she writes in a range, not entirely in this kind of cozy horror vibe. But this is one of those that gets sort of placed there. So I would totally look forward to reading more from her though. So this was an absolute win. Perfect for Halloween. Absolutely, absolutely. So those are 3 that I finished this week. As I said, I've got multiple other things going on for project reading, but things I'm actually reading right now. I'm working on a romance, a shore thing, a historical romance, and I'm also audiobooking Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. So those are the primary focuses at the moment. I watched a number of shows, and I think there are multiple shows I have not checked in on that I did not quite finish this week. So I'm going to run through those, I think, kind of quickly. So most recently, I finished up Fargo seasons 1 and 2, the TV series, obviously not the movie. I had seen the movie years ago. The TV series definitely captures the same vibe and feeling and discomfort. It's really a gritty, small town, over the top crime series. I enjoyed it very much, though it makes me uncomfortable because you really are following a townie, or 2 townies in the second season, who gets in over their head with organized crime, for the most part. And the townie just keeps digging themselves deeper and deeper each time. So I enjoyed both seasons. Both seasons have very different casts, but they are self-contained stories with some interconnection. And I thought they were fantastic, so I'm definitely continuing on with Fargo. The next one I finished was Kevin Can F Himself, which I never heard of when it was on AMC apparently previously, but now it recently got added to Netflix, and that's how I saw it. It stars Annie Murphy. Otherwise, I would not have ever been drawn to it. Annie Murphy is from Schitt's Creek. So I loved this show, and it is a completed, I think, 2-season show. So fantastic, just in terms of every single thing that they're doing in performances, in the delivery of the show, the writing, like stellar. It's a really weird show though. So Annie Murphy is married to Kevin of the title. And whenever Kevin is on screen, the show is shot and performed as a sitcom with a laugh track and everything. But whenever he's off screen, it gets like much more gritty. And specifically, we're following Annie Murphy's character initially. And so we only see her in these kind of gritty moments. And she is clearly like really struggling with her life. Meanwhile, every time Kevin's around, everything's happy and perfect, right? And for me, it's very obvious from early on that this is really an allegory for women in abusive situations. And it does a fantastic job of delivering that. But it kind of goes off the rails into like, I would almost compare it to Breaking Bad, because the decisions made are so wildly over the top. And I think what they're getting at there is how dire and impossible it feels to leave an abusive situation for women that are in that. And so she's making every decision other than leaving. And it just is a really wonderful show that's so smart and is doing really interesting things. So I thought it was fantastic. Then another kind of uncomfortable one, Big Mouth and Human Resources. I can't remember if I've talked about these at all before, because there were multiple seasons and I've been watching them for years. So I probably have talked about them at some point, but I've got completely caught up on everything that's out for those two shows. And they are two shows that are directly connected to each other. So they're animated, definitely very adult shows. Big Mouth is the first one that came out and is following these kids who are going through puberty, and they're hormone monsters that push them to do really horrible things generally. And the awkwardness, the uncomfortable things that they go through. It's about exploring the experience of puberty and human sexuality, about relationships, not just like sexual and romantic relationships and the beginnings of those during puberty, but about familial relationships and the awkward things we have to go through as families, you know? So that then spun off to Human Resources, where we're actually following the hormone monsters in their office, basically, as they do all the strange hormone monster things. And also they have other clients, including adults. So we get a broader view of the hormone monsters. There's a lot of really gross, really uncomfortable stuff, but it is hilarious and has a very star-studded cast. Like Maya Rudolph is in there, Jason Mantzoukas is in there. Just Kristen Schaal, like loads of people. It is a sense of humor that I like. It's very sarcastic and very in your face. And there's a lot of very graphic stuff in it, but so hilarious. I also loved how heartfelt it is. Like, it's very confronting about real human experiences. One of my favorite things is kind of a Bookish tie-in in season 2 of Human Resources. Alice Wong, the author and editor of Disability Visibility and Disability Intimacy, I have to assume the latter was very connected to the show, becomes a character as herself. Like, so in Human Resources, she is there with her hormone monster and becomes a running character on the show. And it explores her experience as someone trying to date with a disability and the myths and misconceptions that she faces and is frustrated by in a very, again, confronting and yet very funny way. And she has a great sense of humor. So it's a perfect fit for her because her tone really vibes with the series. So anyway, that one was a very long running project because they're quite long seasons. And I think there were like 5 seasons of one and 3 seasons of the other or something. And I don't know if it has finished, but between the two shows, they have stopped. There aren't any new episodes coming out currently. And I haven't heard anything announced about new seasons coming out. So they did end at a very good completing place, it feels, if they are done. So I don't know. And then I think lastly, I watched a documentary, Will and Harper, which I, again, thought was pretty fantastic. So no deads here. Will and Harper is Will Ferrell and his friend, who was one of the writers on SNL, who recently transitioned as very much an older adult. And they took a road trip because Harper loved road trips. And so now in her new identity, in kind of Americana, she doesn't quite feel safe and isn't sure about herself in those places. And it was such a just hopeful journey. I mean, they showed some things that were not positive, that were hard moments. But overall, for the most part, they did get acceptance and welcoming, and people who were curious or interested without, and awkward about it, but not rejecting or judgmental necessarily of who Harper was. And I'm sure part of that was because Will Ferrell was there, and that was part of the reason why he went along. Like, it was a protective measure, sort of. But it was just a really very honest and open show or movie, and really took the effort for Will even to ask questions when he wasn't sure. I think having those conversations openly and honestly on camera and demystifying a bit is something that so many people do still need to see. And so I'm very thankful that Harper opened herself up to do that. And it was just such a hopeful show or movie that when I don't have a lot of very hopeful, feel-good things to watch right now, you know? Yeah, so definitely a great one that I recommend. So I think that's it for shows and movies to catch up on from my time off. Let's move into general life catch-up. I guess the break is the first thing to catch up on. So I've had an extended several weeks off of work, and so we're looking to be returning back and to routine. My break was great in that it was a break. I had a fantastic time off. I didn't get everything I wanted to done, but I did get a lot done. I traveled. I read a ton. In fact, so I have kept a separate list outside of my normal logging, and I either started or finished 34 books. And I think I only have 4 of those still in progress. So, and I didn't DNF any, which is a lot. So in just a little bit over a month, I think. Yeah, so a lot of reading, definitely. Though my very beginning and end of my break were somewhat dampened, not the most fantastic. There were barriers to me getting to do or being capable of doing the things I wanted to, for sure. So that was not great, but the middle was fantastic. So now we're, my return to work this week, and also looking forward towards Tuesday with the election. It's feeling like both a return to routine and a potential chaos. So a little bit of trepidation there, definitely. So I don't know what the next week will hold, if it will be chaos or routine. I personally have already voted, so that is good. My Tuesday will not be eaten up by whatever happens during voting. I am in a state that, very fortunately, has opened early voting for the first time this year. In 2020, in fact, we had absentee with excuse voting, but because of the situation in 2020, just that general situation was a valid excuse. So I voted early that year, but we had very few early voting locations. It was a shorter time window, and not a lot of people knew that they could do that. So election day, I think everywhere, but also definitely here, was utter chaos. It was terrible waits. So I'm hoping that early voting will help that quite a bit. In fact, it is extremely hopeful and optimistic to me that the unofficial numbers that I've been seeing are putting us over 30% in my county. I'm in the most populous county in the state. So my county is looking to be over 30% early voted already, and we do still have more early voting on Monday leading up to Tuesday. So that makes me hopeful. I am in a very red state though. So obviously, I'm a very, very left person. Not even a Democrat, I'm unaffiliated, but I'm very far. And so there are very significant consequences to this election for me, in terms of the levels of freedom that I am afforded in my state. As I said, is a very red state. So we've had some hard times in the past couple of years. very definitively at almost every level. And many things are on our ballots this year that are huge. Even down to minimum wage. Right now, we are still at the federal minimum wage, and the state government has prevented cities from raising the minimum wage. Prevented the cities from raising their minimum wage multiple times. So we're looking at raising the state minimum wage. That would be a huge positive impact on so many people's lives if we can get it through and not have our governor overturn it. It is an uphill battle, certainly, but voting, I think, is the primary effective thing that I can do, and I thankfully have done. So I'm cautiously optimistic that at least some of the positive things will go forward in my area, and it won't be a dire loss, but we will see. It could be all doom and gloom. Anyway, I talked about that more than I meant to, but just generally, please, I'm very enthusiastic for you to vote. If you are able, get out and vote as soon as is absolutely possible for yourself. And also take care when you do, because I think it is going to be somewhat chaotic. Be patient with yourself and others whenever you do attempt to do that. I think that's it for checking in on my week, general goings on. I believe no matter what happens in the next week, we're all going to need an awful lot of empathy and kindness to get through it. So I think I will leave that there. So onward, I have one recommendation for this week that I want to push on you. As always, Lindy from Lindy's Magpie Reads is just generally always a delight and someone you should be watching, so you should just go subscribe. But Lindy went to the Vancouver Writers Festival and shared a load about the different panels that she saw and who was there, and just so many really, really wonderful things. I think especially her discussion of Catherine Rundell and the natural world experiences that Catherine Rundell delighted her with was a joy to hear about. So definitely go check that out for sure. So I think that is all for this week in order to get back on this cycle. Hopefully I will be back a couple times this week with other videos and then check in again next week. And that is all if my mental state is healthy and good. We will see how that is though next week. That is all for me today. I hope you're having a wonderful week, and thank you so very much for watching.